Hi everyone, this is Kirsty. I'm one of the academic skills advisors with the skills team. What I'm going to do is talk you through this workshop that I've put together on inquiry-based writing. In this session, I'll be focusing on the assessment criteria and the learning outcomes from your 3,000 word assessment that's all about running a small scale research project in schools. We're going to be pausing the video and the screencast at several points to have a look at some activities. So this is quite an interactive session, but basically we'll be covering the 4 fundamental aspects of your learning criteria so that you've got some tips and some strategies on how to write this assignment in a critical way. So these will look very familiar to you. These are your 4 learning outcomes. What I'm going to do is just work through them step by step and break them down, and we'll look at really, practically speaking, when you sit down to write this assignment, what are some of the things that you should be thinking about, and how could you actually write those paragraphs and write those sections? So we're going to be really practically focused here. So I hope by the end of this screencast, you'll have some ideas that you can put into practice when you sit down to write. Okay, so we'll start off with thinking about the research process. And here really we're thinking about how can we plan a productive and focused inquiry. Now, I know that some of you will have done this already. You might have run this in schools. Some people might still be planning it. That's absolutely fine. What I'm going to talk about in this session really is about the writing aspect. So when you sit down to write about the research process, what do you need to talk about and how will you do that? If we just pause for a second on this research criteria here to do with the research process, the key word that I would highlight to you is the word justifying. Here, this criteria asks you to select and justify appropriate strategies and methods. Now, whenever we write about research projects, whether they're small scale, whether it's like a dissertation or a thesis, it's really important to justify every single decision that you make. Okay, so that means if you chose a particular group of participants, if you decided on one kind of method rather than another, there was a decision-making process that went on there. And critical writing is all about explaining that process. So we can see that you didn't just make those decisions at random, they were informed by the literature, and they were also decided in response to, well, what do I want from this particular research project? What do I want to achieve? So it's about just justifying at every point that you made a decision, just making sure you explain clearly to the reader what was that decision and how did you reach it. So that will be in this section. But the first port of call really for thinking about research design is your research aims and objectives. Now, as I say, some of you may have already kind of conducted this and have a clear idea of your aims and objectives. That's fine. We're really going to focus on how you articulate them. How do you express them in writing? Just to give you a bit of an overview, when we sit down to develop research objectives or plan research, there's 3 key things to think about. Your starting point really is your topic. So what topic is it that you're interested in? And ultimately, why? Why is it relevant to your field? Why is it relevant to your role? How does it link to your practice? But just in general terms, what is your topic of interest? That topic is going to inspire the research aim. And this is, what do you want to achieve with that project? Why are you even running this particular inquiry or this small scale project? What do you want to achieve by the end of it? Because it's from that aim that we then decide on a set of objectives. Now, these are really useful and they're really important to talk about in your research design section, because your objectives, in other words, are the practical tasks and steps that you need to go through, the things that you've got to do and tick off that are going to allow you to reach that aim, because in reaching that aim, you will have in some way tackled or addressed your topic of interest. So start off with that research aim. It's like a mission statement, what you hope to do with that research project, what you hope to achieve by the end of it. You only really need one research aim, and think about it as the what of your research. If someone asked you, what is your project about? In a nutshell, you would give them 1, maybe 2 sentences, and that would be the research aim. It's that statement, that mission statement. It can also be phrased as a question. So if you hear people talk about research questions, that is the same as the research aim. And to give you an example of that, at the bottom there, you'll see in green, the same project articulated first as a statement and then as a question. So we could say, okay, this project aims to develop a series of meditation lessons to help primary school pupils manage anxiety. That is all we need, because later when you get stuck into your methods, participants, etc., you'll tell us, who are those primary school pupils and how many lessons did you run, etc. You can get into that later. Your research aim just needs to capture the essence of what it is you're setting out to do. Or, as I say, you can phrase this as a question. It feels a little more tenuous, maybe a bit more of an exploration. That's absolutely fine. One of these isn't better than the other. So we could ask the question, how can meditation lessons help primary school pupils to manage anxiety? And we could say that this project hopes to answer that question or tackle and provide some information on that question. So once we've got that aim, we can then start to develop our research objectives. Now, you will usually have 3 to 5 research objectives. I think for a project your size with 3,000 words, you probably want to be closer to 3, just so that you're quite focused, you're not spreading yourself too thin, giving yourself, 5, 6 tasks to complete. Really, you want to be focusing on 3 at a push 4. So these tasks are the how of your research. Actually, in practical terms, how are you going to go about running this project? How are you going to collect your data? Now, the phrasing is really important of these. You want to try and be as sort of precise as you can with your choice of verbs. So, are you going to explore, identify, assess? One thing that I wanted to show you here with this hyperlink is just a useful link that I found works really well when you're putting together your research objectives. And it uses Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm sure you're all thinking, oh, we know Bloom's taxonomy, oh no. But I just wanted to flag this up if you've not seen this particular resource before, because I think it is really helpful. So you'll see here what we've got. I've just looked for Bloom's taxonomy verbs. There's lots of different versions of this, but this light bulb version is the one that I really like. So you'll be familiar with this. We've got our different stages of Bloom's taxonomy describing how we build knowledge from more of a fundamental area up through to the kind of more higher order thinking skills of synthesis and evaluation. So have a think in your own projects. What you can do is use your objectives to reflect that you're perhaps starting with some of these fundamental skills and then you're building towards skills like analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. So one of your early, maybe the first research objective you have could be, I want to identify, outline, predict, estimate. Any of those words could help you write that first objective. And then maybe with the later stages, you could move up this hierarchy. So you could start to say, okay, well, I want to identify something, then I want to apply, or maybe I want to interpret or practice. I might actually go as far as to synthesize something and do something new. So maybe I'm developing or designing something within my teaching practice. And then if you have time and if you feel it fits with your project, your third research objective could relate to evaluation. You could build that evaluation of the project into the timeframes and into what you're writing about. So sometimes your last objective could be to appraise or to assess, to evaluate, to explain, etc. Any of these words that show your marker that what you've done is built evaluation and feedback into the structure of that project. So these are just some ideas of the kind of words you can use to phrase those objectives. Now, one of the advantages of setting clear objectives, as it says here in this last bullet point, is that it allows you to look back later and assess your project. So if you say, okay, I'm gonna plan this thing and maybe I'm gonna design a session. And actually, when it came down to it, you didn't have time to do as much design and development as you wanted. You can look back, reflect on that objective and say, well, actually, I feel that although my project did answer some of my objectives, this is an area where I got off track and this is perhaps why. So they're nice because they give you almost criteria that later when you look back on your project and you write in that reflection section of this assignment, you could reflect on your objectives and see, actually, honestly, did you meet them? And were you able to do so in the timescale that you had? Okay, so at this stage, what I'd like you to do is have a look at this example again. So this project aims to develop a series of meditation lessons to help primary school pupils manage anxiety. What I'd like you to do is imagine if you were running that project, what objectives would you give yourself? What are the tasks and steps that that project might involve? If you want to just pause the video here and spend maybe 2-3 minutes having a think about that, and then we'll move on to think about some possible suggestions. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the objectives or the tasks that we might need to complete in order to reach that aim of developing these meditation lessons. First off, identify how meditation affects anxiety levels in children. So we're starting off with an identify, and essentially here we're trying to figure out, does meditation actually affect anxiety? Ideally, we want to show that that is the case and that there are kind of articles, projects, studies out there that prove that link exists. There we give ourselves a precedent. We're saying, this isn't chosen at random, this topic. It's actually based in the literature, and I need to do a bit of identification of what happens there in the existing studies. Similarly, another objective might be to explore how previous studies have used meditation in lessons with primary school pupils. So we're moving on here and we're getting more specific. We're thinking about the application. How have previous studies and previous projects used this technique with a similar group of pupils in a similar context that you'll be working in? Next objective, we're moving here into kind of synthesis and creation. So once we've done that research, maybe we'll design and pilot a series of 5 meditation lessons with Key Stage 1 pupils. So in order to achieve that aim, we're going to have to pilot them. We're going to come up with a rough outline and a design, and we're going to have a go at teaching that to these kids. Lastly, what you could do with your research objectives, as I've just said, is build in that evaluation. So show that you're reflecting, you're assessing how well you did effectively in that project. So to evaluate the impact of the lesson levels from the perspective of pupils and their teachers. We don't have to say any more about how we'll gather that feedback. We don't have to say, well, with pupils, I did focus groups, with teachers, I did surveys. At this stage, again, in a nutshell, what are you hoping to do? I want to evaluate if they actually had an impact on anxiety levels. Okay. Now, as I say, 3 to 5 ideally for your project. I would aim for 3, maybe 4. And with this here, having looked at it now, I think you could combine numbers 1 and 2 because they both relate to the literature in some way. I think you could combine those and have one objective related to establishing what the literature says, the second to the kind of application of the design and the piloting of something, and then your last one about the evaluation. But these could be completely different. The tasks are up to you. What do you feel is achievable? What do you actually want to do as part of your project? But I've just put the verbs there in bold to reflect how they do move from maybe the more basic or the introductory level, and then we move through to more complex skills like design, application, and evaluation. Now, once you've done that, it's important in this learning outcome to talk about the key stages of research planning. Now, when I was thinking about this with a 3,000-word essay, it can be useful to just break it down and decide how many words you've got for each section. So, as a rough guide for a 3,000-word essay, we would say 10% of your word count goes on the introduction, 10% on the conclusion. So that's 300 words for the intro, 300 words for the conclusion. So really, you're working with 2,400 words for the main body. Now, 4 learning outcomes, so we divide it by 4 if we're dealing with those equally. 600 words for each of your criteria, so you've not got a lot of room. You've not got a lot of words to play with, so it's really important to try and be really concise and just capture what does the reader need to know. Think of your research plan as well about if someone were to read your assignment later, ideally they would have just enough information that they could run this project again themselves. So with that in mind, that's why we need to cover these 4 key areas, because these are the essentials for anyone who maybe wants to continue or replicate this research. First off, they need to know about the methodology, for your general research approach, and here we're thinking qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. Now, I read loads of assignments where students go into great detail about what is qualitative research, who does qualitative research, and then they also define quantitative research. Don't do that because you're going to use a lot of your word count just explaining what these things are. Really, all you need are a few sentences, maybe a short paragraph, explaining quite selfishly which is the method that you chose and why. So you might start to make statements like, qualitative research is a popular or is the conventional methodology in the area of, I don't know, peer feedback, or is a key methodology used to assess numeracy levels. Whatever it might be, think about what's the jumping on point for the reader. They don't need to know what qualitative and quantitative mean to get into your project. The first thing they need to know is how does it relate and how is it relevant to your project. So that's where I would start, with the trend that you've identified in the literature and making it really clear how it links to your topic of interest. From the methodology, you can move into the research methods, and this is more interesting because this really gets into the nitty-gritty of what you're doing with your project. So this is things like, well, how do you plan to collect the data? Will you use focus groups? Will you use one-to-one interviews? Will it be observations? And again, remember, justify these decisions. So if you say, right, I want to gather qualitative data, and I think the best way to do that is focus groups. When you sit down to write, you need to be explaining, okay, what are the advantages of focus groups? What are the disadvantages? How did your project account for those possible limitations? If you chose focus groups, why did you use one-to-one interviews? You could talk about one-to-one interviews and the limitations there as a roundabout way of explaining why focus groups are better. But here we're interested in what method did you choose? Where's the precedent for that in the existing research? And why will it help you answer your research objectives? From that, a little bit about participants, who is involved, how will they be recruited, and why this group. Now, I appreciate that your participants might just be, I had to, collect the data for this in May and June, and in May and June I was with year 4. That's absolutely fine. Here, what you can think about is, okay, you were working with, say, year 4 pupils. What are the implications of that on the outcomes? Do you think that project would have been different if you did it with year 1 pupils, year 6 pupils, and how? How would the data generated have been different? Would your methods have changed? And think about, you were working with year 4 pupils, what did you do to kind of make sure your methods fit that group of students? Because maybe to sit down in one-to-one interviews with them would have been too intimidating. You felt that focus groups was better. It's got that conversational aspect. It feels more informal, for example. So do match between those two things. Why were those methods the best for those participants? The last thing that you want to consider then are the ethics. You'll probably be quite familiar with this in terms of safeguarding, etc. So sometimes just a couple of sentences or a short paragraph on this is enough. It's just to show really that you acted in an honest and an open and an ethical way. So what did you do to manage risk? How did you gain consent from those pupils, and was it necessary? And also maybe a sentence or two on anonymising the data. So how did you make sure that this data can't be attached to those pupils? And how will it be stored beyond the project? Will you be keeping hold of it? Why not? As it says at the bottom here in green, the important thing to remember with any of this is just to justify every decision you make. What you want to do really is show how your decisions were informed by the literature and ultimately how they allowed you to reach those research objectives. Why were they the most appropriate or suitable methods for you to use in your project? Okay, so as I say, if you've only got 600 words for that, you can start to decide, okay, with those 600 words, how much goes on the aims and objectives, how much on each of these 4 key stages. And it can just give you a sense, I think sometimes 3,000 words can feel quite big. If we can cut it down in that way, be concise and just capture ultimately, what does this reader really need to know if they were to get a good sense of my project and if they wanted to maybe recreate it or build on it themselves. Now, one thing I wanted to show you was this website. It's called the Sage Research Methods, and it's available through the Library Gateway. I'm just going to jump out of the PowerPoint to show you, because I've got it open in a browser here. Here we go. So if you have a look in the library search, and you just search for Sage Research Methods, search. So it pops up at the top there, look, Sage Research Methods video, practical research and academic skills. It says it's a book, but it's not, so ignore that. The good thing is it says here available online. So if you click that green link there, and from here, blue one, you will be asked to sign in, just so that you can access the content that's available to Hallam students. So we'll log on. And once you've done that, you'll get through to the landing page. Now, this is a database that draws together different case studies, books, journal articles, videos, all related to research methods. So it's really, really useful for a project like yours. If you need some literature to help back up your research methods, your choice of an approach, all that sort of stuff. So I'll just show you a couple of ways that you can navigate this. So up here, you'll see these 3 little lines. If you click that, you can just browse by topic or by discipline. So under discipline, we'll go down to education. And this will just show us all of the content that is filtered by discipline. So anything that is related in some way to research and education. You'll see there's videos with people talking through different kinds of assessment, as well as some case studies. They're the ones that pop up in yellow. Loads of those. And there's also a series of books and articles. There's lots on here. If I go back up to the top just to show you, if you want to search for something specific, in here, Let's say that we're interested in peer learning. Now, the reason I've put that in quotation marks, if you're not sure, is because when we search in search engines, if you put terms inside speech marks, the search engine knows that that counts as a whole term. So if I searched for peer learning like this, so without those quotation marks, it would search for every single article or resource that had the word peer, as well as anything that had the word learning in it. It wouldn't look for things that had them together. Whereas if we do this, the search engine then knows to treat that as a phrase, and it will only find sources that have peer and learning, those words next to each other. However, maybe we want to make this specific, so we say and in capital letters, and we go primary for primary school. That will only find combinations of those terms again. So this will only give us resources that are about peer learning and which include the word primary. Okay? So let's search for that and see what pops up. So when this first loads, you'll see on the right hand side, there's a little box here that says content available to me. Now you will have already signed in, but if you just make sure that that is clicked, that just double checks and makes sure that everything that comes up on your search you can actually fully access with your library account. So you'll see if we start to scroll down, we've got here an encyclopedia entry, so the Sage Encyclopedia of Communication Research Methods. We've got some more of those case studies, but then a few books start to appear. So research in children's experience, some to do with development and evaluation, e-learning if you're doing online, evaluation, action, etc. So loads and loads of resources. What this for me is particularly useful for is if you say, right, I am going to do action-based research, and you think, oh, I should probably try and find something on that. If you just search action-based research, it'll come up with loads and loads of different options for you to help reference that. So if we go to modify search, we could swap that out. We could say, actually, no. Let's go back into it and say I want to do action-based research. Search for that. Remember, content available to me. And we've got a whole list of resources to help with that. Participatory action research, that's a hard word to say. Some ideas of research methods, what constitutes research, qualitative research, and designing research projects. So there's loads and loads in here. It's really helpful then because if you say, right, this is the method that I want to use, you can then come to something like this and just find the research and the evidence that backs it up. The other thing I quickly want to show you on here is if you hover over research tools here at the top and you go down to the methods map, this gives a really neat overview of all the different kinds of research methods you could use. So if you're not sure what's best, you don't really know what route you want to take, this is a really handy starting point. So you'll see what it does is it breaks research methods down into these key ideas. So ethics, planning, design, data collection. So if we say, right, I don't really know how I'm going to collect that data. Okay, here's some ways I could do it. I could do it with mixed methods. It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative. Okay, I think I want to do qualitative. Let's click that. Now we get lots of different types of qualitative data collection. So, okay, do I want to do action research? Do I maybe want to write a case study? Do I think that what I want to do is ethnography? Now, it will keep going down into more and more detail. At the point at which it's too much detail for you, scroll back up and click this one here. So I want to know about ethnography, but I don't really know what any of these are. So I'm just going to stick with that for now. And just to try and get an overview and a sense of what ethnography is in research. Content available to me. And now I get some text that give me an overview and some introductory information. We've got a handbook of ethnography. There we are, straight away, key concepts in ethnography. And if you want to, again, you can start to filter this if we click modify search to make it just give us education results if that's what we want. Okay, so I'd really recommend having a look at this. There's some really good resources on here, and it's particularly good for that research design section because if you know that you need to explain and back up your choice of research methods, you'll find all sorts in that online resource that can help with that. Okay, so we're going to move on now to think about the literature and to think about how can we look for sources, gather sources, and ultimately put them together in a meaningful way. This all relates to the idea of synthesis, okay? So synthesis, when we talk about synthesis in reading, all that means is that you find links and relationships between different texts and different sources. At this level, you want to try and do this more and more, so that rather than relying on individual sources, what you're actually doing in your reading is finding, maybe there's 2, 3, 4 different articles or book chapters, whatever they are, that all maybe fit around a similar subject. Maybe they're examples of consensus, so you find several articles that agree with each other, or they just have a shared theme. So you're synthesizing or linking up that evidence, and that's one really key skill in terms of critical writing. The more you can do that, the more critical your arguments will be, because you're not relying too heavily on one source. Now, in reading, there's two strategies that you can use to do this that will help with your synthesis, and I'm going to quickly run through them both. The first is appraisal grids, and the second is a PEP table. So appraisal grids, these will help you to identify key trends across a range of different sources. From experience, I think it works best with journal articles, and I'll tell you why in a moment when we have a look at the example. The advantages of using something like an appraisal grid is that it gives you comparative notes. It allows you at a glance to see how the research starts to fit together. You can identify themes and trends, and also then in your paragraphs, you'll be discussing a group of articles. You'll be highlighting a trend or something that you found as a theme that keeps appearing in your reading. So again, I'm just going to jump out of the PowerPoint and show you this example. Now, I will make sure you've got a copy of this, whether it's on Blackboard or via email, because it's really useful to have a look at this and how you would adapt it for your own use. So this is an example from mental health nursing. And what you do when you use an appraisal grid is you create a set of categories or headings to guide your note taking. Now, these are good for articles because, as you can see, it breaks an article down into each of its key sections. So things like the article's aims, the research approach, the ethics, the sampling, etc. It might be that you want to add new categories on here. This might actually work quite well for you guys because it's got implications for practice. Maybe that would be implications for future practice. Generalizability, transferability. So, from the literature, do you think it could be applied to different contexts? If you're looking at something from secondary schools, can you take that literature and say, actually, I feel this is transferable to my setting in the primary school, for example? So the idea is, what you do, you get your categories, you sit down with a blank grid, and as you go through your reading for your article, you fill out this grid with your notes. So you say, right, research aims, these are my bullet points, research approach, etc. However, what's really good about this, and if you scroll down, you'll see we've got a second article using the same headings, and later on a third even. Straight away from that then, we can see that there's direct comparison. You've identified themes and links across the literature, because if you say, okay, in my project, I want to use qualitative methods, let me just go back to my notes and see what other article we use the same approach. Okay, article 1, yep, qualitative. Article 2, yeah, that's another qualitative one. Article 3, quantitative. Okay, but I can say, this research project used a qualitative research approach, and then you can link that to Article 1, 2, and show that that's a precedent in the literature, that you've taken something from the literature and maybe responded to it or built on it in some way. So again, what you're doing is linking your choices in your project back to what other researchers are doing in their own work. So it can be really, really useful. It gives you those trends and those links along all sorts of different categories. So that's the appraisal grids. The other way you can do this is to use what we call a PEP table. So PEP stands for Perspectives, Evidence and Position. And this is really useful if you're dealing with a range of sources, so things like book chapters as well as articles. And it's also helpful if you think more thematically. Because some people like to take notes really strategically and really structured and say, they're happy taking notes on things like the ethics and data collection. But you might be dealing more with just ideas and themes from the reading, so the PEP table is particularly good for that. The idea is in the perspective columns, this is where you'll take notes on the different approaches or theories or themes that keep coming up time and again in the reading. They're the perspectives that you can attach to multiple articles. Then in the middle column, there's room for you to write your references, so just keep track of that evidence. Or if you've got an idea that you want to research, you've just not found the sources yet, here you can make a note of where you might find that information. What do you need? What evidence do you need in order to write about that topic or that point of interest? And then the last column, this blue one here on position, this is you, and you can even write this at the planning stage in the first person, because this is what you think of each perspective. What do you feel are the weaknesses in the evidence or its strengths? Have you got any questions? You know, what has that idea, what has that theme got you thinking about? It's your thoughts. So I'll give you an example of this. This is from one of the other skills tutors, Zoe, who's put this together on pizza toppings, but I think it's a really good illustration of how you can use these PEP tables. So if you imagine your research objective was to explore consumer perceptions of acceptable pizza toppings, you go away, you do your reading, and you start to identify some themes or some ideas that are coming out of that literature in more than one article. The first thing you encounter is that you feel like traditional toppings are those that are generally considered acceptable, like pepperoni, margarita, etc. And you've read that in two studies, one from 2015 and one from 2016. But then you start to reflect and you say, okay, but both of these studies, they're only a couple of years old, that's fine, but both of them were published in America. So that's got you thinking, hang on, could it just be American? Is this a cultural thing? Is it that in America, pepperoni and margarita are more acceptable? But what happens if we start to look at the UK or other European countries, or we go further afield? We're starting to think now, actually, other cultures may have different perceptions of what acceptable means. So that's your position, that's your critical interpretation of the evidence. Next example, okay, you might keep reading, and one thing that people are using in their articles quite a bit, maybe in the research design, is something called the original flavour theory. This is a theory you've come across, and it's the idea that it's the originals that will always be perceived as the best or the superior ones. Now, you've read about this theory in two articles, one from 2009, one from 2010. So you might want to maybe mention that those are outdated now. Maybe there's newer research which has developed this further. But again, looking back on this, what's your position? It's got you thinking, well, maybe these ideas are time bound. I mean, pineapple pizza has been around since the 1960s, so for people growing up now, does that feel like an original flavour? They don't know any different. They don't remember a time when pineapple pizza was new. So it could be that the idea of what is acceptable changes over time. That's something you could pick up on in the critical discussion of your essay, and we'll look at where that comes in your paragraphs later on. Okay, so I know this is a bit of a daft example, but it's just to show you if there are themes, there are topics, there are ideas in your research that keep coming up, it's really important to also make notes on your position and your interpretation of them, because that's where you can get into the critical writing. That's where you can get in your opinion in a way that responds to the literature. Now, I was looking through your marking criteria, and I thought what you could do if you wanted was organise this PEP table around that marking criteria, because there's one that says to use an appropriate use of literature, at all stages of study, e.g. professional research and theory. So I wondered if actually those three things could be your perspectives. You could say, okay, what literature have I got on professional stuff? What have I got based in research, and where are my theories? So for the professional, you might have read like publications on professional practice, papers, DOV reports, etc. In research, you might notice there's a few themes, a few common ideas that are coming up in the contemporary research. And then you might find that there's a few theories that a lot of people seem to be using in your area of interest. Okay, so you can use this PEP table to gather those references together. And then any opinions, any ideas you have about them aren't about a single paper, it's about multiple papers. So again, you've got your synthesis, you're ticking that box there. Okay, so before we move on, what I'd say is it doesn't matter. One of these is not better than the other. The important thing is that you find a way when you're reading to make links between different pieces of literature. So whether it's with an appraisal grid, a PEP table, you might be quite happy with your note taking and maybe you just want to go back and colour code them and say, okay, I'm just going to use this purple highlighter and pick out everybody's theories. Let's just work out what theories are people using. And you could write then a paragraph about theory in your assignment. It doesn't matter, but I would stress that the really important thing at this stage is to just try and look for those links and those relationships, because it's going to make that evidence robust and it's going to make your argument feel well grounded in that literature. Okay? So at this point in the workshop, we would have paused and maybe gone downstairs in Charles Street and had a coffee. Okay, so we're about halfway. So if you do want to pause the video now, this would be a good time, I reckon, to go and grab a cup of tea and a biscuit and then come back for the second half. Okay, so in this next section, we're going to start thinking about critical analysis and critical writing. So what we're doing is thinking about what do these things look like in practice? How can we structure paragraphs and write in a way that demonstrates our critical thought processes and our arguments? I wanted to start off by showing you this model for paragraphs because I think it's really, really useful to use something like this so that you are consistently building in that critical thinking. It's easy to try and save it all for the end and talk about it in the conclusion, but what you want to do is make sure it's in every single main body paragraph. Now, your introductions and your conclusions will be slightly different, but this paragraph structure will work for the rest of it. It will work for every single paragraph in the main body of that essay. So you'll know this already, but every paragraph will begin with a topic sentence, okay? This is the sentence that just captures what overall is the topic or the argument that you're pursuing in that paragraph. Or if you're using a lot of literature, what is the trend from the literature that you've identified, okay? You only need one sentence to do this because the next part of the paragraph is where you introduce the evidence. So here's where you'll be able to go into a bit extra detail, maybe flesh out that topic, introduce a bit of context or a subtopic. But treat these two parts here, these first few sentences of any paragraph, as overview and background and context. You're introducing the reader to your idea or to the aspect that you want to deal with. Once you've done that, you want to move into your evidence, and your evidence comes in the centre of the paragraph. You create a little body of research or of reading in the centre of each paragraph. And this will be examples from critical reading, it might be from articles, book chapters, case studies, you might bring in policy documents, you might even bring in a bit of reflection and some examples from your own practice, it doesn't matter. But remember, here with the evidence, we're synthesising. So rather than just mentioning one source, we're mentioning more than one. And they'll all sit under that umbrella or under that theme or idea that you've talked about in the topic sentence and where you introduce the evidence. Okay, so you'll set it up there and then you'll bring in all those linked together examples. Now, lots of students will stop there. Lots of students from essays that I've read do a really good job of giving overview, they show their reading, and then they move on and they talk about something else. And the problem with that is that you're there only in description. You're not moving into the critical, which is why this last section here is so important, okay? Every single paragraph needs to finish off with what we call discussion. It can be one sentence, it can be 5 sentences. It doesn't matter what you do here. The important thing is that you include that critical discussion. And we're going to look in more detail now at what that might include. But in basic terms, it's thinking back to what's your perspective? What's your take on this topic? What do you understand of the evidence? What have you taken from it? Okay, so you're exploring your ideas in more detail. So what do you include in this discussion? It always comes at the end of the paragraph. Make sure it follows on from the evidence, because what you do then is you create an evidence-informed opinion, because any ideas, any interpretation are grounded in the examples you give in the centre of the paragraph. There's lots of different things that you could say here. What I'm going to do now is just jump out and show you an example from one of the handouts that we use in the session to start you off on some ideas on how to be critical. So I'll just come down here and open up this document. Now again, you'll be able to see this in the files that go alongside this screencast. This is critical thinking and reflection, this handout. There's lots of versions of this online, but this is the one that I prefer because I think it gives you a really nice differentiation between what does description look like and what does it look like when I'm moving into being more critical. So for example, if you're being descriptive, you tend to, as it says at the top here, state what happened, okay? However, to be more critical, you identify the significance of what happened. So if we think about this for a second, if you were reflecting on something that happened on placement or in the classroom, you might say, this happened, these children were talking about this, or they were doing this, and this is how I reacted. So it's a factual kind of step-by-step explanation of what actually happened. However, if you want to be critical about that scenario, you need to start talking about the significance. So imagine you're reflecting on a scenario where somebody shouts out and then some kind of disruptive behaviour starts in the classroom. You could describe that, but then in order to be critical, start to talk about the significance. So what was the outcome of that? What were the repercussions? Did it lead to more disruption? Were the kids unsettled? Were they out of their seats? Also think about, well, why was it significant to you? Did it not knock your confidence, but did it make you kind of pause in the lesson? Did it disrupt the flow? Are you now thinking about it 2 weeks later and it stands out to you? You could say, you know, actually, what makes this event significant is that I feel there's more to do in my future practice. I feel there's something I need to do about this. I need some closure on this situation. And that's critical because you're talking there about significance. If we scroll down, a couple of others that are useful here. Descriptive writing tends to explain what a theory says, and I've read loads of essays where people waste their word count explaining what a theory is, giving examples about it, showing different texts. I'm not particularly interested in what that theory says. I need a sentence or two introducing it, but I'm much more interested in what's over here on the right-hand side. Why is that theory relevant or suitable? How is it helpful to you? How do you use it in your work? Is it limited? Who does it work for, but when does it not work? Okay, so you're really interrogating it and picking it apart and starting to think, well, okay, there's this theory, great, how do I use it? Is it suitable? Is it the best thing for me to be using? Similarly, note the methods used. Descriptive writing tends to note what methods are being used. And think about this when you're writing your research design section. Note the methods that you've used. Say, you know, this project used focus groups. Very quickly start talking about this here on the right-hand side. Why were focus groups appropriate or suitable for your research project? Now, we've talked a bit about this already, but if you can do that at the end of the paragraph, that's when you're showing that movement from the kind of evidence and the expert voices of others, and you transition and you move and you finish that paragraph off with your voice, because it's your ideas and your voice that the marker's interested in. That's where you're going to get the credit. That's where you're going to get your marks for critical writing and critical thinking. Okay. So let's have a look at some examples of that in practice then, because it does feel a bit abstract, I think, at the minute. Let's imagine that we're writing a particular paragraph and it begins with this topic sentence. And this topic sentence, as you'll see, it's identifying a trend in the literature. So it says there's a wide range of literature on how to differentiate learning activities in mathematics. And then you'd expect further sentences that explain that and some evidence. We'd like to see the studies that talk about how to differentiate learning activities in maths. Now, let's have a think about what could that discussion sentence include? How could we tie up that paragraph? We could look at that evidence, evaluate it, and decide that we want to talk about the strengths. So we could say, one of the key strengths in this area of research is the use of case studies, as combining established theory with examples of teaching practice means that they're readily transferable into the primary school classroom. Okay. Now, just to say here, the thing to always keep in your mind when you're trying to be critical, the question that you should have in your mind all the time is, so what? Because that is the question that the reader or the marker is going to ask. If you said to me, oh, there's a wide range of literature on how to differentiate learning, I'd say, and? So what? Like, what can you tell me about that literature? In this case, it's that, oh, actually within this body of literature, there's a key strength. However, someone else might read that large range of literature and think, I'm not convinced. For me, it's actually a weakness. So draw attention to that weakness. While the recommendations made in these studies could work in other subject areas, most focus on curriculum level changes and are therefore limited in how far they apply to the work of NQTs. Okay, so it's the same evidence, the same range of sources, but what you perceive as a strength, someone else might perceive as a weakness. With critical writing, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your interpretation is. All I need to see if I'm marking your work is I need to see the evidence, and then I need to see the idea that you've generated from that reading. Okay, and again, to give you another example, a third person might say, okay, there's a wide range of literature, and so what? Well, actually, in light of recent changes to the curriculum, many of these studies are no longer directly relevant to teaching practice in primary schools. So that neatly ties off that paragraph. It gives us the critical interpretation, it gives us the analysis, and then we'll move on to another paragraph. And you might say, however, several publications in the last 2 years are relevant to teaching in primary schools, and then you set up a bit of contrast and a difference. But it's really important, if I'm marking, if I see that the last sentence of the paragraph ends with an APA reference, I know, or I think, hang on a minute, where is the critical thinking? Because the last word in that paragraph is someone else's evidence, it's someone else's thoughts. And what I'm really looking for is your interpretation. So try and keep that in mind when you're writing, to finish off every paragraph with that critical interpretation and your take on the subject or the topic from your reading. What I'd like to do is just have a little think about this yourself. Maybe pause this video and take a minute or two to reflect on this. So there's an example here on this slide. Jacobson's study uses one-to-one interviews with teachers as a research method. However, several other studies gathered data from focus groups. Okay, so we've got a bit of synthesis starting there. We've got two different ideas, the interviews and the focus groups. What I'd like you to do is just pause this and have a think. What sort of thing could you start to include in that discussion section? What could you write about in order to make that a critical paragraph? So I'm not going to give you the answers to this because there is no correct answer. There's so many different things you could say. As I say, as the marker, we're interested in how do you move from the evidence to the interpretation. Straight away, some of the things you might pick up on, Jacobson studies from 2006. It's quite outdated, so that might be something that you pick up on. While Jacobson's study was published 13 years ago and there's been many changes since, other publications have shown that one-to-one interviews are an effective method of research and investigation. Actually, another thing that you could do here in the critical discussion, we need a bit more detail. So who are these teachers? How many teachers? From the same school? Are they from different schools? Are they all in the same subject area or are they across different subjects? And similarly, if you're starting to look at more than one study, compare those participants. Because if Jacobson's study interviewed 30 NQTs from across the country and the focus groups were just colleagues from private schools, one or two people from private schools in conversation, well, then is that comparable? We probably can't put Jacobson's study alongside these other studies. So there's loads of different things you could talk about here. The important thing is that you have that critical interpretation so that the reader isn't left with the question, as they would be after these two sentences. So what? Why do I care that Jacobson did one-to-one and other people did focus groups? So what? See if you can answer that so what with those paragraphs, and that's how you'll move into the critical writing. Now, one key resource for this, and you might have seen this already, but it's a good reminder, is the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank. This hyperlink here in the slides will take you straight to it, and I'm just going to jump out of the PowerPoint now to show the website to you. So here we go. The address is up at the top there. It's just phrasebank.manchester.ac.uk. Now, if you haven't come across this before, what this is a database of phrases that you can use in your academic work. What's brilliant is that it's been compiled for student use, so you don't need to worry about plagiarism. This is absolutely fine. It's been designed for students to use in their own work. It's massive, so it's well worth spending a little bit of time on your own just clicking through this to explore it and see which aspects of it you find most helpful. There's two ways to navigate it. Across the top, you've got your purple boxes. So are you writing an introduction? Are you writing about sources or describing methods? So that could be handy for you guys when you write the research design section. That will give you some sentence starters for how do we describe methods, results, etc. However, the bit that I wanted to show you in this session is over here on the left-hand side. There's a section called Being Critical. Now, if we click on that, we scroll down and we get a number of subheadings. So in addition to some of the ideas we've talked about already, these are some more ways that you might want to be critical about your reading. So you might want to highlight an inadequacy or problem with a number of previous studies, or it might just be a weakness with a single study that you've come across. Other things you can do, and these are particularly good actually for reflective writing, down here look, introducing problems and limitations with methods and practice. So I'll just scroll down here, and if I zoom in a little bit, oops, let's just zoom in so we can see those in more detail. Here we go. So let's imagine that you've introduced a bit of literature, you've talked about several different studies, and you think, actually, I've looked at these studies and I think one problem is actually in their methods. So then you say, to start off your discussion section, one major drawback of this approach is da 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 da. Doesn't matter what you say there, that's your thoughts, your interpretation. But you'll see this sentence, it relates it back to the literature of this approach. Fast forward to that reflective section that you'll be writing, you could equally use any of these sentences to reflect on your own practice. You could say, actually, one major drawback of my approach to teaching was, or further down, perhaps the most serious disadvantage of my choice of method was that it was time consuming. You know, it could be absolutely anything, whatever your interpretation is, it doesn't matter. It's your personal opinion, but you're always linking it back to the literature. So it's that research and that evidence-informed opinion. Just to jump up to the top and show you some of these examples that are more related to the literature. What you could do is give several studies, and all of these sentences will allow you to talk about problems or limitations with them. So you might say, okay, at the top there, previous studies of whatever it is. It could be meditation, it could be peer learning. Previous studies of peer learning have not dealt with primary school classrooms. For example, for you, that could be the limitation or the problem you found in the literature. You could say that researchers have not treated peer learning in much detail. Most studies in the field of peer learning have only focused on. So there's loads of different combinations you can use here, and it's well worth, as I say, after watching this video, I'd say come to the phrase bank and just have a click through and look at all these different sections and see which ones would work for you, where are some of the sentences you like, and you can start building them into the ends of those paragraphs to make them really critical. Okay. So normally now in the session, what we'd do is we'd do this as a group activity. We'd spend a bit of time looking at some extracts of student work. Now, you'll be able to access these. These are all examples around nursing, so they're slightly different from what you'll be doing, but I think that's quite helpful to see examples of writing in a different subject. So if you'd like to, pause this video, have a look at the handout. It's got 3 extracts on it, A, B, C. What I'd like you to do is have a look at those 3 paragraphs and first off, rank them for me from most to least critical. So number 1, the one that you think is the best, down to number 3, the weakest in terms of its critical analysis. But really importantly, as you do that, if you want to grab a pen or a highlighter and just note all the different features of critical analysis in each. So what are they doing well and where are some of the problems? These 3 excerpts are all taken from 3 essays about the topic that's here on this slide. So using the UK smoking ban as a case study, discuss the impact of government policy on public health. So try and keep that question in mind as you read through the 3 extracts, and then pause this video and come back and we'll have a look at some feedback and some ideas on each of those. Okay, so I've just jumped out of the PowerPoint to bring up the 3 extracts, and I'm just going to work through these one by one and talk about some of the feedback that hopefully you've picked up on. So with extract A, this is the one that I think is the least critical. I'd put this down in number 3 for a number of reasons. Big one, first of all, we've not got any references. I mean, it talks about research, it gives us a statistic, but we can't see the citations. So straight away we know that this is going to be limited in terms of the marks it can get because we can't see the evidence that this person's working with. However, I think some of the problems with the criticality of this go a bit deeper. So if we look at that first sentence, research shows that government policy impacts on public health. So it starts out with a very bold claim that research shows or it proves that government policy impacts public health. We then don't get that research. And actually the first thing we get is in one study from America. Hang on a minute, we're talking about the UK smoking ban. Why are you telling us about a study from America? You know, there's no discussion there about maybe that's limited in its relevance. How is it actually relevant? We need to maybe a bit more information on that. And that continues the whole way through. The different pieces of evidence, the different examples are just placed side by side. So there's no synthesis there, there's no link. It's just that they're placed all in the paragraph, kind of plopped down next to each other. And that last sentence too, that's problematic. So when we consider the effects of the smoking ban, it is clear that the government has a positive impact on health. From this paragraph, it isn't clear. It isn't clear that it's had a positive impact or what that impact might have been. Now, be careful of this in your own work because often when we write, we try and sound very confident and we use things like, you know, it's clear or this evidence demonstrates, it proves. You need loads of evidence to prove something. And actually, what's better and what shows that we're being more measured in our approach is to use what we call hedging language. Okay, so hedging language is just more cautious language. And it's the difference between saying it is clear that the government has a positive impact on health or something like, well, it's possible, it's probable, maybe the research indicates, research suggests that the government has a positive impact on health. So we're offering one possible interpretation. Sure, the research might suggest it, but we're not claiming that it's irrefutable 100% proof. And it's giving yourself that wiggle room. It's using that cautious language, which shows to the reader, shows to the marker, that you're just offering one possible interpretation of that evidence. So let's scroll down a little bit and look at extract B. And we might need to zoom out because this one is a little bit longer. So extract B, this is the one that I would say is the most critical. First off, straight away, structure is really good. It's following the structure that we've talked about already. We've got that topic sentence. We can see that the evidence is clustered in the centre of the paragraph. And then we can see that that last sentence, there's no APA references there because what we're getting is opinion and interpretation phrased in an objective and third person style of writing. If we look at the resources and the pieces of research themselves, we can see they're fairly consistent in terms of their dates. They come from a similar time frame and they're linked together. The link there is that they talk about social factors. Okay, so we've got something about anti-smoking campaigns. Then we move on to talk about smoking, income and smoking, unemployment. So they're all sitting together under this umbrella term or this theme of social factors. And you can well imagine that this person maybe filled out a PEP table, and in their perspective they wrote social factors, and in their evidence they listed all these different sources. And then they've written a paragraph that brings them all together. One little stylistic thing as well that's really effective that you should try in your own work is signposting language, linking words. So in here we see words like similarly, moreover, therefore. They're just little flags to the reader on how they should be moving through your argument. Because imagine if you read a piece of evidence and then someone says, oh, similarly, you think, oh, hang on, someone else agrees. There's another piece of evidence to support this idea. If then you say moreover, you think, oh gosh, like a third piece of evidence or a third point that proves this idea is true or that contributes to the idea that this idea is true. On the other hand, if you use words like conversely, in contrast, the reader comes across those words and instantly they see that there's disagreement or there's kind of conflict and debate in the literature. So it's just emphasizing how you've built that synthesis. It's emphasizing the trend or the relationship that you found in the reading. As well, one nice thing that it does is at the end there, we can see that it kind of goes half. It gives us a pro and a con. It says, while there's considerable evidence to suggest this thing, we do need additional qualitative data. So it's nice to have that balance. Don't feel forced to have an interpretation or come down on one side of the fence. You can say, okay, granted, there is some evidence here. However, we could or should or might look at this. You're just positing a potential idea. You're just saying, well, this is one suggestion, this is one possible next step or recommendation. Okay, so let's move on to just look at extract C. Now, extract C is a funny one. It sits somewhere in the middle. It's not as critical as extract B, but it is slightly better than extract A. Straight away, we can see we've got some references. One of them's a bit out of date. We've got something from 2004. So we might maybe question, well, that's 3 years before the smoking ban, so why is that being used as a piece of evidence? But structurally, it has got a topic sentence, it's got the evidence, and then it's got a last sentence that does some critical interpretation. However, the thing here I think we need to start looking for is synthesis, because if we look at the evidence that we've got something from 2012 on social status and income, then we've got something about heart disease, and then we've got 18-year-olds not being able to buy cigarettes. Like, what is the link between the evidence? Where is the synthesis? Because really, we've just got a wide range of literature with no sense of how it all fits together or adds up. Now, the topic sentence claims that what the point of this paragraph is that public health's been impacted in several different countries. Well, which countries? We haven't got any sense of what countries they might be talking about here, so it does lose its way from that topic sentence. We could straight away start working with it and improving it. I can see that if you change that topic sentence and actually said that government legislation is impacting public health in a wide range of ways, that would then start to capture or reflect some of those examples. But they do still need building together and linking up. We don't have the same level of synthesis as we do in extract B. So to just come back to the slides then and look at what these look like side by side, we can see extract A is our least critical. Extract C, there is some attempt to interpret the evidence and give a conclusion, but it's very vague and it's not fully developed. Whereas extract B is ticking all the boxes. And that's how I'd think about it, because I wouldn't want you to go away from this and think, oh God, I'm going to have to write a paragraph that looks like extract B. I don't write like that. That's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to look like that. We're just thinking about ticking some of these key boxes. So if you can write with a clear paragraph structure, that's going to help. If you can make sure you're interpreting and evaluating the evidence, that's a big one in terms of your critical writing. And if then you can kind of come up with limitations that are supported by evidence, and if you can signpost, all of those things are going to add together, hopefully, to a really clear structured paragraph and also one that is critical of the evidence. Okay? Don't worry if your style is slightly different. We're thinking here about what are the key ideas or the key checklist points that we need to go through in order to be clear that we're being critical. Okay? Now then, The last sort of 10-15 minutes of this session look a little bit at reflection. Now, I know you'll have done a lot of reflective writing, you probably do this with journals, or you'll have done assignments on reflection before. So the thing that I wanted to focus on is if we're using that 4-point paragraph structure, how can we adapt that to write reflectively? When I read the assessment criteria, what I took from this section was that you were focusing on two things. First off, how can your research project influence your future practice? And secondly, how do you think it might inform the practice of others? So those kind of two key things, your future and then the practice of others. With that in mind then, let's go back to our paragraph structure and have a think about how we might edit or adapt this for writing about reflection. So our topic sentence here is going to be the aspect of the research project that you think is going to inform your future practice in some way. So what part of that research project has got the legs or has got the potential to inform your future teaching? Again, a sentence is quite short, so we might want to do a little bit more explanation here. Maybe some extra detail to explain what that aspect was and why developing it would be relevant or beneficial, so that you've thought about actually what's the potential outcomes, what's the gain that we might get from taking this idea further. But again, here we're descriptive, we're exploring and explaining the topic for the reader. We then move on to the evidence. Now, there's two things you could do here. We could refer out to literature, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, about how you could do that. But here, evidence could also be examples from your practice. The evidence could be your lived experience and your reflective examples, and that would work in reflective writing. You can use that. But again, we don't want to leave the reader hanging. We need to follow that evidence up with some kind of discussion or interpretation. In reflective writing here, we're looking to the future. So think about what are the outcomes of that potential change, or what are the challenges? So if you say, I want to do this in my future practice, okay, well, what would happen if you did that? What would it look like? What are the challenges of it? What are the benefits of it? How will you manage that process? And also thinking about if you're suggesting you could impact someone else's practice, I would reckon practically you need to reflect on how that would work. So rather than just saying, oh, I think other people should do this, well, why should they and how should they? How could it be adopted and built and developed so that it works for other people as well as it's worked for you? So they're just some things to be thinking about. Now, this paragraph uses that 4-part structure and shows you how it might work in reflective writing. I'm just going to talk you through it step by step rather than asking you to read this and do it on your own. So you can see from this paragraph, our first sentence, it is a topic sentence, and what it does is it underlines and highlights the area of practice or the area of the research project that we could build in the future. One key aspect of my research design that I intend to build into my future practice is using paired conversations between students to reflect on lessons and provide feedback. In a nutshell, that's the part of the project that we think we could take forward. Now, we might need a bit more explanation, a bit more of a kind of overview of what we actually did in that research project. And here you'll see we talk a little bit about that. So pairing pupils together and giving them prompt questions, so reporting back on what that lesson included. But also there's a little reflection in here with that second sentence. You'll see it says, this technique not only provided me with feedback on my teaching practice, but also encouraged pupils to share confidence levels and compare learning experiences. So it's already looking back and reflecting on, well, what did I get from the project? What did I get from this area? And what did the students or the pupils get from it? Now, this is the point at which we want to move into the research. And as I say, I'll just show you in a second the different ways that you can do this. Here, what we're talking about is peer learning research. So I know that's an example I keep using. And we're saying, adaptations to think, pair, share models are common in peer learning research, so we move into a bit of critical analysis here, but the majority of these studies are conducted in higher education. And then we move on to, again, come back to us, that I plan to continue using the strategy in numeracy lessons to check student confidence with new content. Now, again, just as before, ask yourself at this point, so what? Okay, so you've identified something that worked. Okay, other people are doing it in the literature. So what? How are you going to change your practice? What's it going to look like? And you can see proportionally here, that's where we're moving into that critical discussion, and it's a large portion of the paragraph. So we pick up on a potential pitfall. The main challenge in building this technique into my practice would be consistency. I'm not always able to work with the same group of pupils, and one of the key benefits of think, pair, share feedback is rapport. Okay, so we've got a weakness, but okay, Let's think positive. How can we manage or mitigate that? How can we manage it and change it? However, looking ahead to next year as an NQT, I would be keen to build the strategy into my work plans and circulate these with other members of the team. Okay, what's the outcome of this? So what? Well, this would enable us to coordinate as a year group, to identify challenging topics in the curriculum, and to keep track of how pupils narrate their confidence throughout the year. So you move through identifying the part of the project that you think will influence your practice, you link it to the literature, and then you start to think practically about, okay, what are the challenges, but ultimately what are the potential outcomes and the positive things that could come out of developing your practice in this way. Now, I mentioned that you can bring the literature in here. There's a couple of ways that you might do that. As I say, you can use your own examples, as this is reflective writing. Your experience counts as evidence. However, you might think that you want to go back to the reading and bring that in some way. That's fine, and there's three possible ways I reckon that you could do that. First off, one way that you could bring the literature in is to look to the theory. So what theories or models help you to make sense of your findings? So here we're going like big picture. Where does our experience and our little example fit into the bigger theory? There's a sentence here that gives you an example of that. My findings fit with recent studies that apply visual processing theory to teaching reading, for example. The next one, and I think this one maybe has got more potential. I think there's a lot you could do with this. If you wanted to bring in the literature, think about the task and see if you can find any case studies that show other uses for your approach or ideas. So like in this example here, while I introduce buddy working with a focus on teaching grammar, let's look out to the literature. Are other people using buddy working and how? And we think, oh, actually, yeah, I found something from 2015 and something from 2017 where people are using that same strategy. They're using buddy techniques, but they're doing it in other subjects. Okay, so there's actually, the literature is picking up on my idea, or there's a precedent in the literature that your idea, your task, has that potential. It is grounded in the literature in some way. If you can find that, that hopefully then gives you the evidence and the confidence to suggest that this is something you should take forward. Because if other people are doing it, then why shouldn't you be developing it and kind of pursuing it in your future practice? The last one is to get very personal and think about the skills. So don't worry so much about what you did in the classroom, what the outcomes were. Here you're thinking about you. So your personal and professional skills. So you might say that going forwards, actually, what this project highlighted to you is that one of your strengths is with designing activities and running them individually with small groups. So you might want to reflect on that. How could I build that confidence further? Could I look to the literature and find other examples of people building their confidence, and how do they do that? You might look to the literature and find some references just on confidence in teaching. So it's not really the task and it's not the theory, it's more about the personal or the professional skill or that attribute, that characteristic that you want to develop going forwards. Okay, so as I say, don't feel you have to bring in the literature here, because it might be an 80% split. You might have 80% your examples and then just a few pieces of evidence. But if you do go back to the reading, I would either do it on the basis of finding a theory, something that links to your task, or something that links to like a personal skill that you want to take forward and develop in some way. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the session. I just wanted to leave you with a few top tips for boosting that critical aspect of your writing. I've talked about it a lot, but I think the most important thing is to look for those links between your sources. Build that into the centre of those paragraphs, and then really clearly tell that reader what they should understand from those examples. Where are the trends? Where are the similarities? They shouldn't be doing any hard work for themselves. They don't need to work it out, because you're going to give it to them. You're going to tell them at the end of that paragraph, what is the interpretation? What do they need to know? How should they understand that evidence and those examples? Second point, do try and use that discussion section in every single paragraph. It's going to help you be consistently critical. It's going to make sure you're balanced, but it's also going to show that you've got those critical skills in lots of different areas. So you're able to build an argument that's based on looking for strengths and weaknesses and checking if the evidence is relevant to your teaching practice. So just try and get into that habit of following that four-part structure and making sure that none of those paragraphs end with a reference. They should always have that little bit of discussion. And lastly, particularly when you're talking about the research methods, if you make a decision, justify it. Because if someone reads that you chose to do something, straight away they'll think, well, why did you do that and why didn't you do something else? So it's about kind of thinking about what those questions might be and answering them in advance. So explain your reasons for choosing a certain technique. Why did you choose to do focus groups? Why not one-to-one interviews? Why didn't you do a survey? Thinking about why you didn't do things is a nice way of justifying your choice of methods and your choice of participants. So if you come across those decision makings when you're writing, remember, think, oh, I need to explain why I did this, because it's going to show that you are a critical thinker with that research process. At the ends of these slides, I have popped some hyperlinks in and some references. There's a couple at the top, some guides to critical analysis. So you've got one that gives a summary of how to make descriptive writing more analytical. The second one is a series of questions that might help you to be more critical about your reading. The last few are things to do with useful vocabulary. So there's the link there to the phrase bank, but there's also then the reporting verbs. So that's a list of different verbs you can use when you're writing. So if you, instead of saying Jones states, it could be like he argues, he summarizes, he evaluates. There's a list on there of about 200 different verbs that you could use to bring that kind of style and that kind of diversity into your academic writing. And the last one, phrases for reflection. If you just scroll down to pages 3 and 4 of that guide, you'll see lots of phrases like in the phrase bank that you can copy and use in your own work when you're being reflective. Now, hopefully these links will work. If they don't, I'm also going to make sure you have a copy of these slides that aren't in a video, that you can click through in PowerPoint on your own, and those definitely will work. So if you do have trouble accessing them through the screencast, rest assured I'll send you the slides as well to take a look at. Very last slide, just a few tips on getting further support. The first one is if you want to book more workshops, come to one-to-one tutorials, or get feedback in a writing forum on your work, you can find all of that information on the Skills Centre. We're here all the time, we're here all through the summer, so we don't stop teaching when teaching stops. So, if you are looking for workshops and tutorials through the summer, if you've got the odd day when you can get in on campus, then do have a look on our website and see if you can come along to something. If there is something you want to attend but the time is not right, just drop us an email and we'll try as much as we can with staff availability to put it on a campus that suits you at a time that suits you. The latest slots we teach are 6 till 7, so if you prefer an evening slot, again, just drop us an email and we can sort that out. And the last thing that I'd say is just remember that you can access Studiosity through Blackboard. So if you want to get a quick turnaround on feedback, it'll always be within 24 hours. You can use Studiosity and get that feedback really, really quickly. And you can do that up to 10 times in the academic year. So you could do it a couple of times for each of your assignments if you want. So all the information on that will be in Blackboard. You can find that on your list of courses. Okay, so that's everything. I hope this workshop has been helpful. Do get in touch with the Skills Centre, as I say, if you have any questions or if you have any feedback or you'd like future sessions from me. If you just have a chat with Lindsay as well, and the link for the education school. So I'd be more than happy to get together and organise some workshops for you. So good luck with your assignment. I hope it goes well. And thanks for looking at this screencast.